Well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. I'd like to thank the CUP for organizing this event, especially Lauren, and above all, Michael, who's just disappeared, not just for chairing this event, but for many years now, having stewarded our series, Human Rights in History, and made it something I think exceptional. So this event is really a book launch of a kind and celebration for Daniela's book. And my role is just to say a few words about the series in which it's appeared and allow you to ask questions about the broader phenomenon, really, of the history of human rights. And then Daniela can turn properly to our topic, which is her fantastic book. So the series began, I think, precisely 10 years ago. And it's really hard to believe what's happened in those intervening 10 years. The series, in mundane terms, has published over 30 books, but I think it couldn't have been predicted 10 years ago just how explosive this field would become in the scholarly interest it's elicited and the number of books that we've published. In fact, the first book in the series uh, was edited by my co-editor of the series, Stefan Ludwig Hoffmann, called Human Rights in the 20th Century, which itself came from a conference 2 years before in Berlin. And I think at that time, it was a fledgling enterprise. And I think if you'd asked anyone at that conference whether they were participating in the construction of a field that would have this much interest, I think no one would have believed it, and yet it's happened. Uh, Now we could, talk about why that is and the historiographical politics of the last decade, which I think is quite interesting. But let me limit myself to just telling you what's happened in the series. So 10 years ago, I don't think many would have said there was such a field or subfield called the history of human rights. Clearly, Stefan had the idea of a conference, and this series was founded. And I think that was because, to the extent there were attempts to think about where human rights came from, we worried that they weren't properly historical. They focused above all on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and how it had become thinkable, not so much on its aftermath. Now, it's not that this series has neglected that document. In fact, one of our, I think, finest books is by Linda Lindqvist, a Swedish scholar who's done an amazing study of the religious freedom article of the Universal Declaration, how it was negotiated, what it meant in its time. And more broadly, we've never abandoned the idea that the core of the series is the study of the growth of international norms, which makes many of the contributions to this series close to the field of international history. So let me just mention Sarah Snyder's award-winning study of the Helsinki Network, or Stephen Jensen's extraordinarily successful book about international human rights diplomacy in the 1960s. Still, I've been amazed by the way in which, because of what authors have brought to the press, the series has managed to transcend a kind of narrower conception of the history of human rights. And I'll just mention three ways in which that's happened before turning it over to Daniela. The first I would call a series of attempts to localize, or if you want to use a kind of fancy word, glocalize the history of human rights by showing how there are these international and transnational norms, but we must study how they emerge, are championed, resisted in local practice. And so we've had a superb study of Latin America's role in the origins of international human rights politics. We have a forthcoming, stunning book about Polish solidarity and the way in which it did and didn't fit in broader 1970s and 80s developments in the articulation of human rights and international law. Finally, we've had books that have looked at more familiar locales in Anglophone historiography, like the UK, Tom Buchanan's new path-breaking study of Amnesty UK, and how we can think of Amnesty as part of British history and not just a kind of abstract human rights organization, or for that matter, for my own country, Mark Bradley's already classic account of the way human rights fit in American history at different key moments. So that's the first kind of broadening. The second, I would say, is more thematic, and it's been, I think, unanticipated, but for me, extremely productive. It's been a kind of turn towards or incorporation of the history of humanitarianism in the series, which we wouldn't have thought would happen, but has accounted for a good number of the books. Most recently, we have Michael Barnett's edited collection, which is just about how we should think about the relationship in history between humanitarianism and human rights, two abstract terms that we could think about as having different histories altogether or being the same thing or in more sophisticated ways. And some of the great books in the series kind of look at humanitarianism as part of our field. Jacqueline Granick's forthcoming study of Jewish philanthropy, or a bit before, Lasse Herton's absolutely terrific book about post-colonial humanitarianism. The final broadening I'll mention has been, one I've especially favored, not that Michael's ever resisted it, and it's more interdisciplinary. So many of us who have been involved in the series are faithful historians, faithful to the way our discipline frames questions and proceeds to answer them. But it's always interesting for me, at least, to see how other fields might incorporate history in the kinds of approaches they have to humanitarianism and human rights. So we've participated in, for example, a visual turn across the humanities. One of our, I think, most successful books has concerned humanitarian photography. One of my absolute favorites has brought ethnographic insight to how we should think about the historical evolution of witnessing as a cultural practice that's clearly part of what we now think of as human rights culture. So all that considered, well, I'll confess that I signed on to Stefan's project 10 years ago with a bit of hesitation. And in fact, even a few years later, I think I predicted in writing, in print, that the field of the history of human rights was worth shutting down because its life cycle had been concluded. Well, I'm always wrong about many things, but this was near the top of the list, and I can't see any end in sight anymore. And as Michael and Daniela and I were chatting about just before, this last year of 2020 saw the most books published in the series of any year, and I'm sure there's more to come, which is heartwarming. Well, so Daniela's book is breathtaking. I'm going to let her describe what it does. I think in a prior age, it might have been construed as part of a different field of study because it couldn't have been conceived, perhaps at all, or if at all, then in this new historiography of human rights. It does resonate with some other books in our series because we have several that deal with wartime, the exigencies of wartime, and what limits societies impose on the way people are treated in wartime, and whether in the heat of wartime they take those limit seriously. But Daniela actually starts before World War I and goes substantially after it. And I think it's a pioneering study about a topic that she will explain, and it's been a privilege to welcome it to the series and to have you here to talk about it with her. So I'll turn it over to Daniela.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam, for this presentation. Thank you to Michael Watson and Lauren Simpson for organizing this. And thank you, above all, for accepting this book in this series. Thanks to you and Stefan. I really couldn't think of a better series for this book, because this book has been in dialogue with all the literature and all the historiography that came up into this field and that you mentioned in your brief presentation. So the book we are talking today, I mean, this War and Citizenship book has been, and it took a lot of time to write it, also because it was a complicated book. It took me to different archives and places, from the United States to France, to Germany, to Switzerland, to Italy, to Britain. And it was a kind of flying carpet from a certain point of view, because it was really an adventure, a big adventure into a very big topic. It started small, because at the beginning I thought to write a book on enemy aliens in Italy and Germany. It started as a comparative history of enemy aliens in Italy and Germany, and then it grew bigger in time, because at the beginning I thought that comparative history of Italy and Germany in the First World War, and then as Sam mentioned, the book went back. I mean, my research went back to basically the French Revolution. And so I followed, I mean, the many interstate wars of that occurred during the 19th century. So the book tells the story of the hundreds of thousands of people who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. It tells the story of what happens, or what could happen, to enemy aliens when a war breaks out. And possibly, first of all, I need to explain who is an enemy alien. So an enemy alien is a civilian, is a non-combatant, someone who possesses the nationality of an enemy country, but who does not bear any personal responsibility for the outbreak of a war, but who is at a certain point of a war considered, responsible for the war as a kind of proxy for his or her state of origin. So this book deals so with enemy aliens, and I can say it's the first comprehensive global history of the treatment of enemy aliens. There have been other books on enemy aliens, but this book focuses on national cases. So this is the first comparative and comprehensive history of enemy aliens over a long period. I mean, starting with the French Revolution and ending up with the First World War, but even the period, the aftermath of the First World War. Ideally, it ends with the failed attempt at writing an international convention on the protection of enemy aliens in 1934 at the Tokyo Conference, at the Tokyo International Red Cross Conference in 1934. So it's, of course, very hard to give, in such a short time, a precise account of a book that covers such a long span of time, and also moves across 5 continents. But in a nutshell, I can say that it addresses the dilemma. So the main issue, is the dilemma of balancing security and liberty, security and rights. So the dilemma that every state at war addresses and still address. I mean, think, for example, at the war on terrorism. So how to balance the security and the request of security put forward by populations and the rights. I mean, not stripping people from of their rights. This dilemma emerged as a particularly tricky and difficult one to solve, especially, of course, in liberal democratic societies. It was less tricky in the absolutist regimes of the Russian Empire or the Ottoman Empire, of course, that it was particularly complicated and problematic in countries like UK or France or even Italy or the United States, who pretended to be, liberal democratic society. So the trading of liberty for national security, so with limitation on freedom, discrimination between citizens and non-citizens, and persecution of internal, national, ethnic, or religious groups, especially in the multi-ethnic empires, shook in a certain way the very principles on which these societies were based and highlighted their vulnerability. So the book is many things at the same time. It is a story, of the many ways in which states at war, when faced with real or alleged security threats, redrew the boundaries between members and non-members, redefined the inclusion and exclusion, and reshaped the path to citizenship and enjoyment of rights. It is an investigation into the emergence of the concept of enemy aliens in international law. It is also a story of the state policies on aliens up to the First World War. It is a story, of course, of the implementation of these policies and of their consequences on the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. It is a story of the First World War from this specific perspective. And it is a story of changing notions and practices of citizenship and rights in wartime. So War and Citizenship, this book, it identifies the First World War as a watershed, as a turning point in policies on aliens, enemy aliens, immigrants, and stateless people. I would like to mention another book that has just appeared, not in this series, but at Harvard University Press, the book of Mira Siegelberg on statelessness, which is an absolutely wonderful book. And I think it's it's kind of parallel book to this one. It's the two books, I think, dialogue very, very, very well. And the topic of statelessness is a topic that resurfaces now and then also in my book, and these two books I think that can be really read in a certain way, like an entanglement of and like entangled books. Anyway, so this at the outbreak of the war, so this is First World War was a watershed from many points of view, and so I cannot explain everything. But the fact is that with this war, governments of almost all the warring countries. So there is the interesting thing is that there is a very common pattern that put together liberal democracies, authoritarian states, absolutist states, who went more or less all in the same direction, and took measures that curtailed profoundly the rights of people in general and of enemy aliens in particular. So as a consequence of the measures and the provisions that warring country took, enemy aliens were interned, expelled, deported, their property were sequestrated, confiscated, or liquidated. They were stripped of the right to free speech and to assembly. They were stripped of the right to travel, to move around, to the freedom. They were stripped from the freedom to acquire, own, or sell and transmit property. They were stripped of the right to file a lawsuit, to defend themselves in court. They were denied the right to fair trial, and so on. They were prevented from changing nationality and were sometimes deprived of their nationality and disenfranchised. So, but I think I already took too much time to speak about this book. I just want to briefly say, and I can come back to some parts of the book and to the structure of the book during the question time. The only thing, the thing I want to say in conclusion is that I think that my book demonstrates that the tension between the protection and guarantee of rights and liberty on one side and security on the other has almost everywhere been decided in favor of the latter. And that each country, regardless of its political system, choose national security, even if this meant over everything, even if this meant reducing freedom, discriminating among citizens and non-citizens, violating international law, and establishing. So the entire war was kind of established on this equation between aliens, foreigners, and dangerousness. And I give the floor back to Michael, I guess, or and to the questions that will come up from the people who are listening to us. So thank you for your attention.
Well, I think it would be as we kind of let questions accumulate for ourselves. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask two to start, and then we can. I see Michael has also asked one.
Sure.
In the chat.
Lovely.
So, we really should get into the heart of your book and talk about the kind of the content in more detail. But I was struck that at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that you felt you were in close dialogue with this now decade-long historiography of human rights, and that maybe you could have come to this topic anyway, but you feel that the book is appropriately placed in the series. So I wonder if you could spell out how you see it fitting with this larger conversation. Second, I wanted to ask about how it reflects on our time. So, when I hear you talk about liberty and security, it resonates with the national debates around what to do after 9/11 and the fears of excess, or for that matter, in my country now, in response to new perceptions of domestic terrorism, which of course you had in your country in the 1970s. So do you feel that you were also providing a reflection or motivated by events even now in our own time in writing this book?
Well, I start from this second question because in a certain way, this book started with 9/11 and started with reading about the Patriot Act, about Guantanamo, about reading the article of Ronald Dworkin in the New York Review of Books and proclaiming that what the United States was doing was completely against so the US way of thinking and acting and dealing with rights, liberty, and freedom. And one of the books that at the beginning sparked this idea of working on the First World War was a book written by a law professor at Georgetown University, David Cole, which is called exactly Enemy Aliens. So, and he was kind of reviewing the premises of the Patriot Act and the way in which Arabs were to be kind of transformed. American citizens of Arab origins were to be transformed in enemy aliens. And he mentioned very briefly, well, of course, he mentioned largely the internment of Japanese Americans in the Second World War, and he also mentioned very briefly the First World War. So I was really trying, when I started this research, I was really interested in looking at which was the first war in which this dilemma, in which this clash between liberty and security, rights and security. I mean, I was really interested in understanding if there was a novelty, or if there was the possibility to trace a genealogy, not of course a linear, a unique genealogy, but this was really the idea that this was the moment in which I started to think, to conceive, this research. So, I mean, this research resonates with many issues, many contemporary issues, and it's for cause. I mean, it's not just an accident. As to your first question, I think, well, there are always, I mean, also important, how can I say, when anyone is working on a research, there are important moments in which we meet people, we meet other historians, we meet other people with whom we speak, and we start, I mean, digging into things. And one of these very important encounter for me was being in Freiburg with Stefan Ludwig Hoffmann. And so this, I mean, that was one of the moments in which this research was almost at the beginning. So it started independently from this field of studies, but in a certain way had many kind of points of entrance in this field of study. I never conceived myself as a historian of the First World War. So this one of the reasons I think this series is a good place for this book, because I think that this book is more about rights. It's more about how citizenship started to be linked to rights. Citizenship as a legal device is not always about rights. I mean, the idea that citizenship is about rights is a very contemporary idea, but in 19th century and for large part of the 20th century, the relationship between citizenship and rights is a very loose relationship. So I mean, the focus of this book is really about how rights came into the framework, how rights started to, add to citizenship and to our, contemporary conception of citizenship as individually related to rights. So I don't know whether I
that's terrific.
Your questions.
They're absolutely responsive. I think it would be useful, just in case people aren't don't have access to the chat box or aren't monitoring, if I just ask their questions on their behalf and you can answer. So I'll ask two kind of that invite you to talk about the kind of core content of the book more than you have. First comes from Michael, and it's really to ask you to explain for the audience how you kind of periodize the war and show in detail how it's not as if a set of measures inherited from the past are just continued, throughout without changes. Maybe a second question could, go to your coverage. So you mentioned that you started thinking you would compare Italy and Germany, but someone from the audience wants to know how far you went in studying the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, since we know that the politics of enemy aliens are were not restricted to Central Europe. And so, what did you study those cases, and what might you be able to say about how similar or different they were?
Yeah. So first of all, I can say that the measures evolved very little over the world, because the measures, all the policies against enemy aliens were implemented during the very first month of the war. And the interesting thing is that every country that entered the war at a later moment implemented the same measure, more or less. So at the end of the 1914, almost the entire architecture of measures had been set up in Britain, in France, in Germany, and also in the Ottoman Empire, in the Russian Empire. So and in Japan, all the participants at that stage had already implemented all the measures. And then when Italy came into the war and joined the war, and then Bulgaria and then Romania, up to the United States in April 1917, and China, etc., every country implemented the same measure. There was a kind of copycat model in a certain way. But of course, there is a range. And there is this range of measure, and the differences between let's say the United Kingdom and the Russian Empire or the Ottoman Empire are not in the kind of measures they established, but in the way in which they implemented the measures. So in the radicality, or in the violence, or in the consequences that then this measure had on other groups, which were not initially the target group, but that at a certain point became kind of assimilated to the enemy alien, to the enemy alien group. And yes, I worked also on the Russian Empire and on the Ottoman Empire. The things I need to say is that I worked, this book is of course built on primary sources and secondary sources. I manage sources in 6 different languages, but I don't have Russian, and I don't have Ottoman Turkish. So for the Ottoman Turkish part and for the Russian part, I mainly relied on literature. There is also fantastic literature on these 2 countries, especially on Russia, on the Russian Empire. It's a wonderful book of Eric Lohr. And but also, since the majority of enemy aliens in the First World War were Germans, the German sources were a kind of point of access. The German primary sources were a point of access also to the Russian Empire, to in two other countries. So, for example, was exceptional points of entrance to the colonial space. So, I don't know, from Togo, Cameroon to South Africa or Hong Kong. So there, I mean, and the archives, I see that there is a question on archives. I mean, the administrative and especially the foreign office sources of Germany and of course France, Britain, United States were a very, I mean, significant and interesting point of entrance also on countries for which I didn't do primary research in their archives. I see that there is also a question on Jews, question about the Jews. Was citizenship sued as a means to include Jews in a bigger collective identity or to exclude them during the 19th century in Europe?
I think you could broaden it even because you know, and I think that's a really interesting question that asks you, I suppose, whether events in Jewish history, in you know, as Jews were accorded, you know, citizenship in the 19th century, do we see, you know, in a way like Hannah Arendt did, some anticipation of things that happen not just to Jews but to non-Jews in the 20th century. But I also think you could go beyond and talk about, you know, how Jews figure in your study, you know, and in the different places that you take up.
Yeah. Now, of course, Jews have a place, an important place in my book, because of course Jews were either treated as enemy aliens in some of these countries. So, for example, in the Russian Empire, Jews started to be deported alongside the ethnic Germans, especially during the occupation of Galicia and in first months of the war. And then the Russians stopped because there was the pressure of Britons and French and the French government as they were allied, and also because they were kind of preoccupied with spreading Jews outside of the Pale of Settlement. So deporting them was kind of a problem for the Russian Empire in itself. But at the same time, Jews were targeted also as friendly aliens in Britain or France, where there was plenty of Russian Jews who had fled the discrimination provisions at the end of the 19th century and who were kind of refugees in Britain and in France. And when the First World War broke out, because the Russian Empire was an ally of France and Britain, these Jews were considered like traitors, like people who betrayed their country and who were kind of escaping the war, avoiding going into the military, avoiding to go to the trenches. So there was a kind of surge in anti-Semitism in France and in Britain. There was kind of that targeted people who were apparently friendly, and Jews were, according to the situation and to the moment of the war, put together with Germans and so considered as collaborators, or I mean, there is the usual ongoing story about about Jews that repeat in the First World War and in different instances in the First World War. Jews from Galicia who were refugees in Vienna and who experienced, of course, discrimination also there at this point, because they were considered as too close to the Ukrainian parts of to the Russian parts of the Russian border. So I mean, for Jews, it was. I mean, First World War was again an experience. Of course, nothing in comparison to the Second World War, of course, but it was an experience of. There was a surge of anti-Semitism all over Europe, and in different disguise. One can say in different disguise.
All right, let me we have a few more questions, and I'll just ask two together. So it would be great if, first of all, if you could talk about the end of the book, since it doesn't end in 1918, but talks about the fate of these restrictions. And Michael Watson asks you to talk about the attempts to roll back the treatment of enemy aliens imposed in wartime, and why it was so difficult to do so. I wonder if you could also address, you mentioned the 1934 Tokyo draft, and just how you see the experience of the World War affecting the future development of international norms around wartime treatment. Whether the constraints that later generations might expect are rooted in the reflection on what happened in World War I.
Yeah. Well, the exit from the war was particularly difficult. First of all, because as we all know, the war didn't stop in November 1918, but it continued. It continued at least up until 1923. It continued in Eastern Europe, where there were, wars between Poland and Ukraine, Poland and Bolshevik Russia. There was a civil war in the former Russian Empire, and there was the war between Greece and Turkey that ended with the forced exchange of population in 1923. So the war went on, and it was particularly difficult to go back to normality. State of emergency, even though it was lifted in many countries, but there is no possibility after state of emergency to go back as business as usual. There is always something that stays and crept. Many things crept into the legislation of the countries that proclaimed state of emergency. One of the legacy, there were many legacies of this situation. One of the legacies was, the politics of migration control. That was kind of a son of the provisions of the First World War, also on enemy aliens and on freedom of travel. One of the legacies was the difficulties for many to naturalize. One of the legacies was denaturalization. Denaturalization, stripping people of their citizenship and making them stateless was one of the main novelty introduced during the First World War, and one of the legacies that really stayed for a long time, and also had a new, there was a sort of leap of quality in the 20s, in the beginning of 20s, because not only people of enemy origins started to be stripped of their nationality, but also people with birthright citizenship, like, for example, the many Russians, the many, former subjects of the Russian Empire, who were stripped by Lenin decree of December 1921, or all the people that ended up having the Nansen passport for stateless people, mainly Russian and Armenians who were stripped, that survived, the Armenians who survived the massacres, who survived the genocide, who ended up being stripped of their Ottoman, then Turkish nationality. But there are many legacies of this kind, and so the exit from the exit from the end of the war was particularly long and difficult. People came back from internment camps. It took some time to come back, and then there was a big legacy for property rights. So many people never recovered their property, their assets. They did not have compensation, even though the treaties established compensation for the liquidated property, but Germany was not able to pay for compensation, and was able to pay very little for compensation. So that, from this point of view, there are really many legacies into the 1920s. And I can say, as far, for example, property rights are concerned, into the Second World War. When the Second World War started, there was still an office of the alien property custodian, for example, in the United States. There was still kind of liquidating German property sequestered during the First World War. So when the Second World War started, this office, in a certain way, continued to work with the new, group of enemy aliens, where there were, again, the Germans, but there were at this point other nationalities. But yes, the book ends exactly as I mentioned, with the attempt to write a convention on enemy aliens. There was a huge debate in the 20s among international lawyers at the Red Cross International Committee of the Red Cross, the American International Law Association, about protecting the rights of enemy aliens. There was an acknowledgement that this was that this had been a novelty that no convention, like, for example, the Hague Convention of 1899 and 1907 had envisaged. So no one had envisaged the fact that this kind of civilian could become a target. So there was a huge effort on the part, especially of the International Red Cross, that dealt with the internment of civilians during the war. After, a first moment of surprise, in a certain way, they started to, the agency for the prisoners of war opened a branch for civilians. So they saw especially the problem of internment as a humanitarian problem. So the convention was, of course, not yet, in the narrative on human rights that was in the narrative, I mean, really rooted in the narrative of the new humanitarian, about which, for example, Bruno Caban wrote a book, which is, I think, in the series, or possibly no, is in another series of Cambridge University Press. But anyway, I mean, humanitarianism was one of the legacy of the war. And from this point of view, the attempt at writing this convention that took the 20s and the beginning of the 30s, I mean, this was one of the legacies. But while it was relatively easier to rewrite the Geneva Convention, it was not easy at all to include civilians. So no one wanted to sign this 1934 convention, and when the Second World War broke out and the International Committee of the Red Cross tried again to propose the convention, no country was, interested to endorse it. In a certain way, this convention is also it's a kind of harbinger of the 1949 Geneva Convention, which of course is kind of more extended, and the number of civilians and the civilians that the concept of civilians in the 1949 Convention expanded, and it's not limited, of course, only to the enemy aliens, whereas the 1934 Tokyo draft was kind of too limited, possibly, to be successful.
Right. So in the waning minutes, I'll just return to one question in the chat that's close to one of my original questions, but I'll reformulate it, and you just have a couple of minutes to reflect on it. So it's really going back to the war on terror. I was struck in your opening presentation that you said kind of gave a kind of bleak conclusion that when we study history, we see that in contest between liberty and security, the government always wins and security prevails. And I think that's true. And, there's a lot of evidence from the war on terror that supports that view. On the other hand, you've been discussing the push for more norms. In the war on terror, there was a push to stop torture, and it was stopped. At least, in its most flagrant forms. So I wonder if we could emerge from this webinar, at least, with a little less depression, because otherwise we get the outcome that, studying the past just tells us we can never overcome it.
Well, I think that no, there is a way to end with a kind of more optimistic note. I think that in a certain way, also the First World War and narrative on enemy aliens, and the failure and the resurgence of international law was in a certain, is a kind of there is a possibility to strike an optimistic note. And the optimistic note is that law, even when violated, is a discourse which is available to those who want to use it. So without a narrative on international law, there was no possibility to speak about violation of international law. If you speak about violation, it's because there is something that is a kind of beacon that cannot be violated. So from this point of view, the story of the First World War is also a story of the success of a discourse, of a narrative, on which, with which every country should make, should settle a kind of scores in a certain way. I mean, you have, in order to violate international law or to violate law, you have to justify the violation. You have to find the legitimation. You have to, and this is something which is not always easy. So, and from these two wars, at the end, we had, I mean, tribunals, international tribunals, international conventions, and even though, I mean, many countries didn't sign into this international convention, but they are there. They are there for a discourse that everyone can use to make to plead for rights, whether human, civil, social, or political.